We spend years trying to figure out what we want, and most of the time, we think we're getting closer. But what if the direction was never the problem? What if the choices themselves were never really ours? We spend a large part of our lives trying to figure out what we actually want, changing paths, switching goals, starting over again and again. And most of the time, we call it confusion. We say things like, I don't know what I want in life. It sounds temporary, like something we'll eventually figure out. But for a lot of us, it doesn't really go away. It just changes shape. We stop one goal and move to another. We change direction, but the feeling stays the same. Like we're always moving, but never actually arriving. And the strange part is, even when things are going well, the question doesn't go away. What do we actually want? Not in a dramatic way, not as a crisis, but quietly in the background of everything we do. And maybe the problem isn't that we don't know what we want. Maybe we've just never really questioned where those wants came from. If we look closely, very few of our desires actually start with us. They take shape early, before we even realize it. What we see around us, what gets rewarded, what gets admired, it all begins to define what feels important. Certain paths start to feel right, not because we chose them, but because we've seen them enough times. And slowly, without ever making a clear decision, we begin to move in that direction. We don't just discover what we want, we absorb it. From expectations we didn't question, from environments we grew up in, from lives we keep observing. And over time, those influences stop feeling external. They start to feel like our own voice, like our own decisions. But if we pause for a moment and actually look at the things we're chasing, we might notice something uncomfortable. We don't always want the thing itself. We want what it represents. The identity it gives us, the validation it brings, the way it looks from the outside. We're not just chasing outcomes. We're chasing the feeling of being seen. And sometimes the feeling of being envied. And when you see it that way, it becomes harder to tell which desires are actually ours and which ones we've simply learned to want. But if we go a little deeper, there's a pattern hiding underneath all this. We don't just want things. We want to be the kind of person who has those things. Not the outcome itself, but what that outcome says about us. The image, the identity, the way it looks from the outside. And over time, that line becomes harder to see between what we genuinely want and what we've learned to associate with meaning. Because the more we see something being admired, the more it starts to feel valuable. Not necessarily to us, but in general. And slowly, without noticing it, we begin to chase it. Not because we chose it, but because it feels like something worth choosing. And that's where things start to blur. Because now, our desires don't feel borrowed anymore. They feel real. But maybe that's the illusion. Maybe what we're calling clarity is just familiarity. Familiar goals, familiar definitions of success, familiar versions of a life that looks right. And when enough of it feels familiar, we stop questioning it. We accept it as our own. But if we're honest, how much of what we want did we actually choose? And how much of it did we simply inherit without ever realizing it? Borrowed desires. That's what a lot of this becomes. Not false, just unexamined. And maybe that's not an accident. Maybe there's a reason we stay in this state for so long. Because as long as we're still figuring it out, we don't have to fully commit to anything. And if we don't commit, we don't have to face what happens if we're wrong. So we keep searching, adjusting, reframing the path. Not always because we're lost, but because staying lost feels safer. Safer than choosing something and realizing it wasn't really ours. Safer than letting go of the version of ourselves we've been building toward. Because once we see it clearly, we can't unsee it. And that clarity comes with a cost. It asks us to change direction, to disappoint expectations, to take responsibility for what we choose next. And that's not easy. So instead, we stay somewhere in between. Not fully lost, but not fully decided either. A kind of silent pause where nothing is completely wrong, but nothing feels completely right. And from the outside, it looks like we're progressing, but internally, we're still waiting to feel certain, waiting to feel ready, waiting to finally know what we actually want. But maybe that moment doesn't come until we're willing to question everything we've been following so far. So maybe the question was never, what do we want? Maybe the real question is, what would be left if we stopped copying everything around us? If we removed the expectations, the comparisons, the versions of life we've been trying to match? What would actually remain? Because once we start to see it, it becomes harder to ignore, harder to keep chasing something just because it looks right from the outside. And maybe that's where this starts to feel different. Not clear, just more honest. Because the hardest part isn't finding the answer. It's admitting that the answer we've been following might not have been ours. And if that's true, then the version of ourselves we've been trying to become might not even exist. And that realization doesn't give us direction. It removes it. But maybe that's where something real finally has a chance to begin.